is it a good idea to buy a property, or should I carry on renting? Now, at the moment, especially given that interest rates on mortgages have recently increased, I'd say it's probably a hotter topic than ever. Now, this video is not aimed at persuading you either way. What I'm going to do throughout is give you an impartial, unbiased viewpoint on the pros and cons of renting versus the pros and cons of buying. It's then up to you to make up your mind on what you feel is right for you and your situation. Now, before we get into the detail of today's video, do make sure if after I explain these pros and cons, now is the right time for you to purchase a property, then make sure that you head over to our website, which is dm.mortgage, and there you can book in for an appointment with our mortgage advice team, and we can help guide and assist you further to getting you onto the property ladder. To start with, let's look at some of the advantages of renting a property. So first of all, we're going to look at renting, pros and cons, then we're going to look at buying, pros and cons. So the first advantage of renting a property is all about flexibility. Now, when you rent a property, you can have tenancies obviously as short as even 6 months. So if you're the sort of person that likes to move from place to place to place every 6 to 12 months, then flexibility or renting is going to give you that flexibility. Now, alongside flexibility, it also allows you to exit that agreement much easier and more cost efficiently than if you were buying a property. Because if you were to sell a property, the costs involved with that and the time it might take is usually a much more drawn out process. So let's say, for example, you're living with your partner and there's an unfortunate relationship breakdown and you decide to go your separate ways. It's much messier if you've purchased a property compared to if you were renting a property. So flexibility, I think, is a key point to consider with renting, and it is one of the advantages. Now, the next advantage is to renting a property is that you've got limited responsibilities. So as a renter, you're not going to be responsible for things like maintenance costs, so major expenses. If the boiler breaks, you don't have to fix it. You just call your landlord and they should replace it in a timely manner. So you don't have the financial burden of unexpected repairs. Now, also, you can opt for furnished places. So again, you've got limited responsibilities in terms of how much furniture you need to buy in some instances. So if that's something that's important to you, then renting can be a good option. The next advantage is that it's easier to rent a home. There's easier entry or less barriers to entry, shall I say, than if you were to purchase a home. So getting onto the rental ladder is often more affordable and just much quicker and easier because you obviously don't need to find a mortgage deal. You haven't got stamp duty, legal fees. There's often a lower initial financial commitment. Now let's focus on some of the disadvantages of being a renter. Now, when you rent a property, you still do have upfront costs. Like I said, they might be lower initially than if you were to buy a property, but often you've still got upfront costs. So that often includes a deposit, the first month's rent, and that can of course sometimes put a strain on the ability for you to rent a property quite quickly. Now, the second disadvantage is rent increases, and for me this is a big one because there's a lot of talk, particularly at the moment with the fact that interest rates have recently risen in terms of is it better to stay as a renter? But renters should not lose sight of the fact that rents can increase, and actually arguably you've got less certainty over when and how those rent increases take place than if you had purchased a property. Because of course, if you buy a property, you can tie into a fixed rate for 2, 3, 5, even nowadays 10, or even for the full term and duration of the mortgage. Whereas if you're renting a property, the landlord's got every right when that lease comes up for renewal to increase the rent, so it can be harder to budget long term. And again, just throwing a statistic out there, in May, the average rent in London has hit a record high. It's now on average £2,039 a month, which is the highest it's ever been. So again, in my opinion, there's no more certainty in terms of how much your payments will be if you're renting versus if you're owning. But of course, that's a generalised statement, and it does depend on, what options you choose if you buy a property versus what landlord you have. But it is something to consider. Now, the next disadvantage I actually touched on in the advantages as well, and that is that you've got limited control over, maintenance and what you can do with the property. So it works both ways. It can be an advantage, but let's say that you've got a landlord that doesn't jump onto problems quickly, then again, you're not in control of when those repairs take place or maintenance if it's required. You might have an unfortunate landlord who drags their feet with things like that. And also, one of the disadvantages under the same topic is that you can't add your own personalised stamp to things. You often need permission to decorate. And even if you don't need permission to decorate, again, do you want to spend time, effort and money essentially refurbishing and making somebody else's property look great? Now, another point to raise, and this is again quite a big one for me, a disadvantage, is that there is an uncertainty of how long you can actually stay in that property. Now, let's say that your landlord decides to sell the property and you're forced to find somewhere new to live. That could disrupt your life. If you've got children and you've moved there for certain schools, it could interrupt that, and again, you've got additional moving costs to move somewhere else. Furthermore, it's not uncommon to have disputes over deposit returns. That can sometimes arise. So you could think that you've left the property in a certain state, but the landlord disagrees. But also, at the moment under Section 21, a landlord can ask you to leave the property with only 2 months' notice. Now, that's not a lot of time. So, if you're living in a property, you've got the uncertainty of knowing that your landlord could just ask you to up and leave at any point. Now, there are changes in progress to Section 21 that does mean that landlords have to give much longer notice, which will obviously help renters in that respect, but ultimately those changes are not implemented yet. So again, you just need to be mindful that very little notice, you could have to make a major change to your accommodation. So now guys, let's look at owning your own property, and I'm firstly going to focus on some of the benefits of owning your own home. Now, the biggest one for me, and probably the most important one to most people, is that unlike rent payments, when you make a mortgage payment, assuming that it is a repayment mortgage, then every payment that you make is building up equity in your home. So you are building up an investment, and it's your investment. Whereas when you're renting a property, you don't see, once that rent payment is made, you don't have any further benefit from that rent payment. So that is a serious consideration, and that is one of the biggest benefits, I feel, just my personal opinion, in owning a home over renting one. Now, another benefit of owning your own home is that, as I mentioned earlier, to some extent you can have more certainty over what your monthly payments are. Now, this largely comes down to what mortgage products you choose when you take the mortgage out. But ultimately, let's say that you were in a 5-year fixed rate or a 10-year fixed rate or a fixed rate for the full mortgage term, then you could have certainty for that duration of time on what your monthly mortgage payments are. Whereas if you're renting a property, no such option exists. So again, you've got that uncertainty with renting. You've potentially got it with buying, but that does depend, like I say, on what mortgage product you choose. But it is possible to have certainty of your payments for a long period of time if that's what gives you peace of mind. Now, another advantage of owning your own home, long-term security. So again, you don't have the risk of a landlord just saying 2 months notice, you've got to up and leave. You know that as long as you keep meeting those mortgage repayments, that you've got a home, and you've got a home for the long term. Now, another advantage of owning a property is personalisation. So again, I brought this up in the rental section as well. But if you own your own home, you can personalise it. You can personalise it as much or as little as you want. And that's important for many people, to make them feel like it's a home. And I think that's important. And what comes with that personalisation is that you can also control repairs when they take place. Again, if the boiler breaks, you've got control over how quickly you replace it. Now, the flip side of that, it is an additional financial burden, depending on what the repair is, but ultimately it gives you much more control when you own your own property. Now, one of the other benefits of owning your own home is long-term financial benefits. Now, over time, as you pay more off your mortgage, you will, if you're on a repayment mortgage and it's 25 years long, assuming you keep up with the repayments, then you will at the end of that term own the entirety of the property. So that is going to give you financial security, but also potential returns if the property prices appreciate. Now, I accepted or granted that there's no guarantee that property prices will increase, but historically property prices have always increased. So again, I think that that's a fairly reliable measure to look forward in the future. Yes, we might have small periods of time where property prices dip, but over the longer term, property prices generally tend to appreciate. Again, if you've been renting for 25 years versus owning for 25 years on a 25-year term mortgage, at the end of that mortgage term, let's say you've got the property and it's worth £300,000, that is a £300,000 investment. Whereas if you have been renting for that same period of time, you do not have an investment at the end of that term. And I think that that's a big consideration. Okay, so now what we're going to do is focus on some of the disadvantages of buying a property. Now, one of the main drawbacks is the ability to save up a deposit. Now, if you're saving a deposit, it can be challenging, it can be time consuming, especially if you're already renting. To find that additional money to put towards a deposit is hard. With that said, there are new innovative products that have come out recently. So things like 100% mortgages where you don't need a deposit. Again, on the face of it, that product might sound a little bit scary, but I've got another video where I actually interviewed Skipton Building Society, who are behind this new mortgage product. And actually, once you find out more about how the product works, you'll see that this lender is taking a much more responsible approach to previous lenders that have offered this type of product. So I would recommend that you check that video out if that's something that you're interested in. Now, there are also products out there like deposit booster products and other innovative things if you are struggling to save a deposit to help you. But nonetheless, it is one of the drawbacks of owning a property. Now, another drawback, I'm going to make this one very quick because I've mentioned it throughout, but financial responsibilities, again, additional responsibilities when you're buying a home. The mortgage costs, the legal fees, potential stamp duty payments, these all increase the upfront costs of home ownership, but not to mention ongoing costs of things like repairs, maintenance and expenses, which now as a homeowner are going to be your responsibility. Now, I also want to talk about market and price risks because again, I did mention this as an advantage in terms of if property prices go up, then you can tap into the equity and it's an investment for you. However, you know, housing or homeowners are subject to the housing market and price movements, and they don't always work in your favour. So if the value of your home drops to below the mortgage amount, then you may be in what's called negative equity, and that can make it difficult to obtain a remortgage or sell your property without additional savings to cover the difference. Because let's say that you owe £200,000 on your mortgage, and the value of that property goes to £190,000. If you wanted to sell that home, you've got to come up with the £10,000 difference to pay the lender. So negative equity is, you know, something to think about. Now, I will be honest with you, in the many years that I've been in financial services, I have come across a very small handful of people that have been in negative equity, predominantly after 2008, shortly after. So it's not a common thing, but it does happen. Again, there are things that you can do to mitigate that risk, i.e. putting in a bigger deposit or making sure that you're buying an investment that is well priced initially. But ultimately, it is still a risk of being a homeowner. Now, again, sort of expanding on the topic of uncertainty, one of the other things to bear in mind is interest rates, what happens when they increase. So I've spoken a lot about this topic recently as interest rates have recently increased, but that can have an impact on mortgage payments and gradually push up costs for homeowners. Now, as I've mentioned throughout this video, you also have the same issue with renting a property. Rental prices can increase, and as interest rates on mortgages go up, landlords often put their rents up. So again, I think that's something that affects people across the board, but that is still, you know, a thing that you need to consider if you are becoming a homeowner, but also that can impact or should impact on the type of mortgage product that you choose if you do decide to buy a property, because depending on the product, that can lower that risk. Now, you need to consider your own circumstances to weigh up what is right for you, because I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all approach here. But again, remember, we are here to support you in that decision making. So if you've decided that you are going to purchase a home or you're still not sure, then do check in with us, find out what your affordability is, find out what the costs are specific to your situation, because only then, once you've got all of your options on the table, in my opinion, can you make an informed decision. But I hope that that video has gone some way to helping you to weigh up the pros and the cons of both renting and buying a property. So head over to our website if you do want to look at your mortgage options, and that's dm.mortgage, and there you can book in for an appointment with our mortgage advice team, and we can look at mortgage options from high street specialist lenders, thousands of products, to look at what your costs would be if you were to take on a mortgage, but also look at overall what your costs would be in terms of the overall buying process. So we're here to support and guide you, and also make sure that you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell if today's video has been useful, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next episode.